Thank you, Leo. So I promise you, this is not a bait and switch. I know you guys probably came here to think about and talk about voting rights, and here we are talking about a new set of standards that half the room has never heard of. But it is important, and the C3 standards are a really helpful way to frame our instruction. So I'm just going to go briefly, for those of you that have never heard of these things before, I'm going to go briefly through them just to help us conceptualize what this might look like in our classrooms. So what is the C3 framework? Well, at its heart it's an inquiry arc of education. So the core of any C3 unit, if you want to frame it that way, is a question. Building from that, the C3 is a set of standards. It's not scope and sequence. It's not a laundry list of content that you need to teach. It's simply discipline-specific standards. And right now, the disciplines, they have standards for geography, economics, civics, and history. And the last thing, that third C that Leo spoke to, civic life or citizenship, is really embedded in the C3 framework insofar that the inquiry arc promotes active and responsible citizenship. So let's get into kind of nuts and bolts of the inquiry arc. There's 4 parts to it. There's 4 dimensions to the C3. Dimension 1 is basically developing questions. What is the inquiry that we're going to explore as a class together? Dimension 2 is applying disciplinary tools and concepts. This is kind of like the thinking like a historian, thinking like an economist, thinking like a political scientist part of the inquiry. Dimension 3 is actually evaluating sources and using evidence. This is what we do as social studies teachers all the time. That's the content, those are the documents. And Dimension 4, the last C, the citizenship part, that's communicating conclusions and taking informed actions. So promoting responsible citizenship means taking action, which is really at the heart of C3. When I look at, well, a year ago when I looked at the C3 framework, Dimensions 2 and 3 were really, really familiar to me. That seemed like what I had been doing for my 10 years as a social studies teacher. Dimension 1 seemed familiar, kind of like, I know we've all heard of critical questions. And Dimension 4 was the scary one. That was the one that I was least familiar with. That was the one that was like, oh my God, what's this going to look like in my classroom? So we're going to spend some time now just kind of thinking about Dimensions 1 and 4 because they're probably the least familiar with those. So you guys should have a handout that says craft questions that matter. Everybody has a craft questions that matter? This is it's kind of a guiding document for how to develop good questions. And the particular vernacular, the jargon that C3 uses, is we're using the phrase compelling question as opposed to critical question. And I think they differ in two important ways. A compelling question is one that can be answered through an inquiry, and a compelling question is one that demands action. So if we contrast that with a critical question, a classic critical question is, what is justice? Oh, it's critical question or essential question. Thanks, Sandy. What is justice? And that's a great question, but after a month of exploring that, I'm not sure that you're going to have an answer for what is justice, and I'm not sure that students are going to be compelled to act upon what they've learned, whereas ideally, compelling questions will arrive at an answer and be prompted to take some form of action. So if we look at kind of the checklist of things for a compelling question, number one, most important thing, the compelling question has to emerge from students' curiosities. It has to kind of get under their skin. It has to kind of be interesting to students. So let's do a quick brainstorming. We're here to talk about voting rights. Can anybody think of a question about voting rights that might pique students' interests? Thinking about what's going on in their lives, what's going on in the news. What's a question about voting rights that might get students interested in the topic? Yep.
There's a movement to lower the voting age to 16.
Okay. So voting age is certainly something that a lot of high school students get interested in. Yeah, Electra.
Why do you think identification cards might be useful in voting?
Voter ID versus voter suppression, right? That debate. Anything else? Yep.
Compulsory voting.
Compulsory voting. Some countries you're forced to vote. Should we be forced to vote? That's an interesting topic to explore. Yep.
Why should you vote?
Why should you vote? Does your vote even matter, right? In this democracy with hundreds of millions of people, what does one vote really matter anyway? Anything else? Yeah.
Is our community voting more or less than the communities around us?
That's a great one. So how does our community's collective voice compare to other communities' collective voice as it relates to the ballot box? That's awesome. Anything else? Those are really, really good ones to get started with. And those are questions that like students would be like, oh, this doesn't seem like some boring unit about the Constitution. This is about something going on in today's world that will affect me and affect my community. So the other kind of criteria for compelling questions, they require students to apply disciplinary concepts and skills. So it's perhaps easiest to think of questions that don't do this. When was Pearl Harbor? Right? That doesn't require any disciplinary concepts or skills. That requires memorization. Good compelling questions require students to construct an argument in response. They address problems and issues found across disciplines. So we're not living in this siloed world of US history and world history and geography and never shall they meet, right? We have to embrace kind of the intersection of the Venn diagrams as they relate to social studies, and US history inherently relates to geography and economics and world history. And so we need to embrace that. Compelling questions ground themselves in social studies content, and ideally, good compelling questions are free of jargon and teacher speak and edu-speak, and are really something that emerge from the student's way of thinking about issues, not the way in which adults or educational professionals think about issues. So before I go on, are there any questions about compelling questions? Yeah.
So they're not really daily aim questions, more like a guided question for a unit?
Yeah, thank you for that. So these are like the guiding, so I spoke about the inquiry arc. This is the question that fuels that inquiry. This is the one question that you'd spend the unit doing. And that can be a week-long unit, it can be a month-long unit, however, whatever you think that question merits.
Other, main questions for
Yeah,
the day.
exactly.
Can I say something?
Yeah, please.
That's a good point, and really another difference between compelling questions and essential questions is a compelling question you really would talk about it at the dinner table with your family. It would be interesting enough to talk about it, but it would also be big enough that that conversation would very quickly transition to, well, before we can really talk about that question, we have to look at this smaller form of that question, which we call a supporting question, right? So before we can really get at the issue of should voting age be lowered to 16? Well, are teens responsible enough to vote? Right? Now we'll be talking about that at the dinner table. And if the compelling question is strong enough, the families will get involved. Neighbors will be discussing it. And I've actually seen that happen.
Okay. It's on the free of jargon part.
Yep.
I mean, you're talking about teacher jargon, like students will be able to, that sort of thing, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Because subject-related jargon is important for the vocabulary and everything.
Absolutely. So disciplinary vocabulary is important, but exactly what you said.
But it should be
Yeah.
accessible to families.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
I mean, but you may have to reason through educate your question,
sure.
teach
And-
your question.
Any other questions about compelling questions? I've got a couple samples here. So I'm a global history teacher, and early this year was our unit on nationalism. And so my compelling question for that unit was, why are there 196 countries in the world? And I don't think kids have ever thought about it. And why aren't there 4? Why aren't there 4,000? And kids kind of got them interested. And it fueled our inquiry and our exploration of nationalism. A colleague of mine who was teaching civil rights this year, his compelling question was, who is responsible for the successes of the civil rights movement? Kind of promoting a deeper understanding, getting beyond, MLK and the common list of names that we explore in U.S. history classes. So just two examples of how we frame this. I'm going to go quickly through the second and third dimensions because this is what we do as social studies teachers every day. D2 is applying disciplinary concepts and tools. This is, like I said, thinking like a political scientist or an economist, geographer, or historian. This is students applying the lenses, the disciplinary specific lenses, to the question and the inquiry at hand. Andy actually used a great analogy. He said D2 is like a shovel and D3 is the earth. So D3 are the documents. They're the actual materials that students are going to get down and dirty with, evaluating sources and using evidence. I included a PDF of this chart in your packets just because I found it so elegant and simple and kind of all-encompassing for what at least I try to do as a history teacher. I'm sure there's lots of history teachers in the room. So when we're helping students evaluate sources and marshaling evidence, really, if I can get students to go through the act of sourcing a document, contextualizing a document, corroborating the document, and going through a close read of that document, I'm doing a pretty darn good job as a history teacher if I can promote these things and lead students through this. So this was like a brilliant one-pager. It's from the Stanford History Education Group. So it has discussion prompts that students can use. It has the questions that students should be asking as they interact with different documents. So hopefully some of you might find that helpful to your classrooms as well. The last dimension of C3 is the scariest one. It's the newest one. It's that communicating conclusions and or taking informed action. The C3 document itself does not include the or part. I included it because I was scared of the word and. As the first year teaching global history using C3, I wasn't sure I was ready for students to communicate conclusions and take informed action for every unit that we did. So I've kind of split it up. And so your students can do both or they can do one. But at its heart, D4 is about the practice of active and responsible citizenship. And in this context, we're using citizenship as a verb, right? Engaging responsibly in a democratic society. Because I know that word for some of our classrooms, many of us teach people who are not citizens. And so it's not meant to be exclusionary in any way. But as part of this, as part of practicing active citizenship, we need to have students engage in the world outside of the classroom, however form that might take. There's lots of ways that can happen. And we want in our classrooms to cultivate collective and collaborative action. Students working together for a common goal, engaging in their democratic communities. So what does this look like? That sounds really nice, and that's like a beautiful thing to think about. We've got a menu of potential actions here, and these two should be in your packet. And a colleague of mine put this together, and I really like the way she framed it. She has kind of 3 avenues of action. There are formal channels, there are direct action, and there's community dialogue. And depending on what your question was, it should kind of lead you to what your action's going to be. So this is kind of the moment where I repeat the mantra that the medium is the message. What you're having your students do is as important as what they're learning, and in many ways you can't separate the two of them. So formal channels, these are like the avenues of power and ways to affect change in communities. Direct action is taking it to the streets, and community dialogue is sharing your conclusions with the wider community outside of your classroom. And there's lots of things up there that students may do, may not do, things that you might be comfortable with, things you might not be comfortable with. Are there any questions, kind of responses, concerns about the menu of action, what you might or might not do with your classes as you kind of look at the list? Anything about D4 that has you on edge? Yeah.
Well, are you suggesting that they would plan these out or actually execute them?
Execute them.
Okay, so who's gonna pay the legal bills?
Yeah, so that's a question. That's a completely legitimate question, and I would maybe caution that if that's a concern of yours, maybe you pump the brakes a little bit and find a different avenue of action.
Well,
Right.
just
Yeah.
for instance.
Yeah, please.
Students at a high school in the county where I teach, took a wildcat strike on hands up, don't shoot. And so they left the building and interrupted instruction time. They were unaccompanied. They were, in a dangerous situation in a dangerous area. Basically it was a disaster, potential disaster. Fortunately, no one was injured or anything. And then my local went and gave them an award for that. And so what's going to happen now is anytime there's an issue or anything, they're going to go walking and or there's a midterm exam, they're going to go walking out and protest of not enough filling in the Twinkies or something.
Right. So they've got one of these down well,
Yeah.
right? And now there's a lot of other ones that they need to learn about. And you kind of steer their enthusiasm for action down a different street.
Right.
Any other questions, concerns about taking action? Yeah.
Just to add to that,
Yeah.
I mean, if part of D4, I don't know, it's like written in there, but it should be to like evaluate how effective that was, right?
That's a really, really, really good question, is how do you know if your action's been successful or not?
Well, in real life, like when you take action, you then like go back and reflect on it so that, next time you can make it better. So that would be important to include.
Right.
So they're not just like doing things to do.
Just for the sake of doing it, but
Yeah.
we have an intention here, and did we meet our intentions? That's a really good point. Yeah, Christine?
Tim, I guess one of the great conversations with students would be about what constitutes effective action, and which of these would be the most powerful action for the circumstance. And by having this discussion with students, you could probably subtly bring in some of the risks around certain actions and help them to understand why some are more powerful and effective than others.
Yeah, and I was a wimp and I was scared of the action piece this year, and so I kind of lived in that third column, which is community dialogue, which is effectively like, sharing your conclusions with the wider world. That's a very safe thing to do, and nobody's going to get in trouble for having their students share what they've learned with others. So depending on where you are on the spectrum of being comfortable with this, there's a lot of different options for you.
But how do you balance?
Go ahead, I'm
How
sorry.
do you balance the line between getting them to take action from what I've been hearing the rest of us are saying, getting them to take the action we want them to take? Because I'm not always comfortable.
That's right.
I have the right answers for the right action. I have to look at them in their world that they're living in.
Yep.
In the world that we're preparing them for. Okay, may not have been as safe as my world is.
Yep.
Yet they have to have their own challenges.
That's brilliant. Leo, do you want to speak to that, or were you going to speak to?
Yeah, I mean, there certainly are risks and dangers here, but one of the risks and dangers is that we forget when we were 18 years old, what we were doing and why we wanted to do it, and the sorts of things, I will date myself, but the sorts of things that I involved myself in terms of protest around civil rights and against the Vietnam War. And so I think what's really key here is that students leave this exercise with a sense of their efficacy as civic agents, that this is a world, when we talk about citizenship, that this is a world that they can act in and change. And so, I mean, one of the problems that, when I was a kid in the Vietnam War probably was that there weren't older people engaging us in these kind of conversations about what's effective action and stuff like that. But I think the risks around actually getting students involved in action are important risks to take if we think about what the goal of what we're trying to accomplish is.
Any other questions about the menu of action, the perils? Bob?
It's a great conversation, and it's wonderful to engage with one's class. But it's Hegelian in terms of its turning. As professionals, and certainly in New York City in the Bloomberg era, we're on very, very tenuous turf while activating our students for the highest of motives and reasons, because the threats, certainly in my school, are real. Not implied, they are real and punitive and retributive and totally divorced from reality and what the goal of the action would be. And like we just left a conversation of the New York, the UFT, and I had written down moral relevance versus in real polity versus idealism, social humanism. And as a teacher, it's very challenging. And in this era where people don't have tenure and are easily dismissed,
Yep.
it's again, I go back. It's tenuous turf. It's a moral problem for me as an educator, both of my students, and maybe more importantly as a representative of my staff.
Yep.
I mean, it's always engaging, but it's ongoing. I don't know what to say.
Yeah. Other comments, and I'll show you an example of a safe way that a classroom has done this. Yeah, let me do that now. So, I've got, as part of a great national project, Speak Truth to Power. Has anybody heard of that project? It's brilliant.
If you haven't, please write that down, because you can look that up, and it is an incredibly great program that a colleague of our comrade of ours, Joe Carb, is one of the main people in. And Leo's been a main supporter of that. Speak Truth to Power is an incredible film project that asks students to learn about people who stand up for human rights across the world. And we're going to just show you 2 minutes of one example of one of the winning videos from last year. And he says the videos this year are even better.
So these are students, high school students in Chicago. They were exploring activist John Lewis, and in the context of voting rights, to kind of ground it back to what we're doing here today. So we're going to look at just a couple-minute clip of what these students did.
What's the name again?
In our community, there are people who can vote, but just can't be bothered. There are also people who love to vote, but are undocumented and they aren't allowed to.
Bien, ¿cómo estás?
Está bien, gracias. ¿Usted?
Bien, bien. ¿Qué hiciste en la escuela hoy?
Hoy en clase de economía nos registramos para votar.
Qué bien, yo siempre he querido hacer eso, nunca he podido, tengo la privilegia. Qué bueno, hija.
Sí, lo estoy haciendo por usted y por la familia. Yo sé que usted ha estado aquí en este país más de 20 años y quiero que su voz sea escuchada a través de mí.
Qué bien, hija, y eso va a ser la primera de la familia que va a tener voz aquí en Estados Unidos. Muy bien.
Sí, lo hago para que así sea escuchada su voz.
Bob, can I ask you a question?
Sure.
I don't never see you vote. Why is that?
I feel like my vote wouldn't make a difference anyway.
Why do you feel like that? I mean, your vote is your voice.
No, money is a voice. If you're rich in this country, then you get what you want.
But, I mean, it's a lot of people that feel like that, and that's why nothing happens, because you feel like you should stay at home and not vote because it don't make a difference. If everybody that felt that way just get out there and vote, we would see a change.
Wow, I didn't know you were so passionate about that.
I really am. I just turned 18. It's exciting. I want to do it. Like, can you come with me?
Yes, I would love to experience your first voting, and I guess I could get back into it.
Thanks, Mom.
In January of 2014, Illinois passed a law that let 17-year-olds vote. It allows them to understand, but there are some conditions.
En enero del 2014, Illinois aprobó una ley que permite que las personas de 17 años puedan votar. La ley es muy simple de entender, pero hay algunas condiciones.
17-year-olds can only vote in the primary, but they will be 18 by the time the general election comes around in November. We decided to try and register every eligible 17-year-old in our school.
Las personas de 17 años pueden votar solamente si cumplirán 18 años en el tiempo que las elecciones generales vengan, cerca de noviembre. Decidimos intentar registrar cada persona elegible de 17 años en nuestra escuela.
Let it play?
10 more seconds.
All right, 10 more seconds.
Take a look over 100 voter registration forms. And you can bet that students of Gage Park are going to have an impact on this permanent election.
Te apostamos que los estudiantes de Gage Park van a tener un gran impacto en esta.
All right. So nobody's going to get fired for doing that, right? Like tenure or not. There was a change in the law in Illinois that allows 17-year-olds to vote in the primaries if they're going to be 18 by the general. These students saw that. They spoke to their families about the act of voting, and then they registered their peers in their school to become eligible voters. So they communicated their results through the video. They took informed action by having a voter registration drive. So kind of checking off 2 boxes on that menu of change. Any questions or reactions before I turn it over to Andy, who's going to kind of walk us through what this would look like in a classroom? Yeah.
I want to say, I know that my colleague over here might see it as a risk, but for 10 years, especially as an Afro-Latina in a Title I school, I always engage my students about Brown versus the Board of Education, voting rights, because if you grow up in a neighborhood that you don't like this, and they're experiencing, not thinking their voice matters, if you don't expose your students to that and you don't talk to them about that, that's just another generation is going to continue and no change is going to happen. So I feel like I came into teaching to make a difference, and no matter what anybody says, I feel like if this is my passion and I know what I'm doing is right, be damned with what everybody else does.
Speaking to Leo's point of the moral imperative of teaching this stuff. Any last questions about C3 framework?
No,
Yeah, go
I
for
was
it.
in Chicago
Okay.
on that
Yeah.
primary election,
Yeah.
and it made a difference. They were able to force the runoff.
Amazing.
And people were engaged, and a lot more young people voted than they expected. And so it works.
That's great. That's great. Thank you for that. Yeah.
Is the C3 framework in the packet, or can we find that?
The C3 framework is easily Googleable, and you can get the full PDF version online. Yep.